श्री स्वामीनारायण भगवान ની જય, અક્ષર પુરુષોત્તમ મહારાજની જય, પ્રમુખ સ્વામી મહારાજની જય, મહંત સ્વામી મહારાજની જય, પ્રમુખ સ્વામી મહારાજ શતાબ્દી મહોત્સવની જય. As we carry on journeying Pramukh Swami Maharaj's life based on the biography written by Puja Adarsh Jivan Swami, in the last session we talked about how Swami Shri, how Shantilal was in Chansad and had gathered with his friends to buy some cricket equipment. They were supposed to go to Vadodara to go and buy the cricket equipment. And suddenly a letter from Shastriji Maharaj was received. As soon as Shantilal received that letter, he went home and he decided to give up everything, because the letter was from Shastriji Maharaj instructing him to give up everything and become a sadhu. And so immediately, because of his Guru's Agna, Shantilal went home. He told his friends that I'm going to have to leave right now, because Shastriji Maharaj no letter આવ્યો છે એટલા માટે. His friends requested him, it's only a few more days before Diwali, why don't you just stay and we can finish off this game of cricket. Nevertheless, Shantilal was very focused કે Shastriji Maharaj no letter આવ્યો છે and I'm going to have to leave. And so he took that to task, went home, explained to his parents. His parents also blessed him and were very happy with the decision, because there was already a discussion that had taken place before, where Shastriji Maharaj had mentioned to Moti Bhai that one of the three brothers or the three sons is going to come, and he had in particularly at that time pointed out to Shantilal. So on that day, Shantilal then decided to leave home, and that was the last time that Shantilal saw Chansad. But what happened next was a little bit of a difficult journey as well. We're looking at page 41 and 43. We're going to review these pages again. So renouncing home was his only goal. To please Shastriji Maharaj was his only goal. And he was very determined to reach home, to reach to Shastriji Maharaj as soon as possible. His first stop was at a village called Bhaili. And from there, it seemed like it was a very simple journey all the way to Bochasan. However, they got there the following day, and then eventually they reached a village called Sakarda, where he was met with Ghanshyam Swami. We discussed Puja Ghanshyam Swami earlier. So Ghanshyam Swami at that time, they stayed in the mandir in Sakarda. As the New Year's festivities were just around the corner, they were only 3 days away. The local devotees from the village, they requested Ghanshyam Swami to stay back, and so that they could celebrate the Ankut festivities with him. And Ghanshyam Swami agreed to this. But then he told Shantilal that after Diwali, after the Ankut festivities, we want to distribute prasad and sanctified sweets to all the Hari Bhaktas in the village nearby. And so why don't you go to Bochasan and you can pick up some of the sanctified prasad from there, get some sweets, and come back. So then Shantilal took these words. He went with Shanti Bhagat, with Shankar Bhagat. They went all the way to Sakarda, the station. They went to Ranoli station, which was nearby. And from Ranoli station, they reached Bochasan. At night, he met Nirgun Swami. And then Shantilal explained to him that, that he had actually been sent by Ghanshyam Swami to Bochasan to collect some of the sweets, and so that he could take them back. As soon as Nirgun Swami heard this, Nirgun Swami said, look, I will write a note to Ghanshyam Swami explaining that what my plans are. And he explained that I want you to stay here. He told Shantilal to stay there. He sent Ishwar Bhagat with some of the prasad and explained this and sent a note with him to Ghanshyam Swami. It was pretty evident that Nirgun Swami was also impressed by Shantilal and he wanted to keep Shantilal with him. And so he suggested that the festival of Kartik Ekadashi, which is about 15 days away, and Shastriji Maharaj will be coming to Ahmedabad. And so the goal was that they would, Nirgun Swami and Shantilal would actually go all the way to Ahmedabad eventually and meet Shastriji Maharaj over there. So he told him to stay in Bochasan, do Ankut and everything over here. And eventually, as soon as this was over, Shantilal was very excited knowing that now he's going to meet Shastriji Maharaj very soon. However, plans weren't as he had in his mind, because as soon as he joined Nirgun Swami's schedule was very, very busy because constantly he had to deal with a lot of administrative responsibilities for the Sanstha. He was involved in holding lots of meetings with devotees here and there. And the program, Nirgun Swami's program was always scheduled at the last minute. At the 11th hour, things would change. Unexpectedly, he would have to go from one village to another village. And Shantilal had to join Nirgun Swami with all this. Despite that, he carried on. And something that seemed very, very close suddenly became a little bit agonizingly long. Shantilal was in a very similar situation at that time. So he wanted to eagerly meet Shastriji Maharaj. But the journey kept getting longer and longer. Eventually, they got to Nadiad. But from Nadiad, Ahmedabad wasn't too far. But due to some government work and court work that Nirgun Swami had to go to different places, he ended up going to Borsad, then he went to Bhadran, and then finally they got to Nadiad. In Nadiad, Shantilal's health took a bit of a turn and he became ill because Nirgun Swami's schedule was so packed. Every morning he would leave early in the morning with a sant by the name of Hari Vallabh Swami just to finish off their work. No fixed time of what time they're going to get back. Eventually, when they go back to the residence, Shantilal had a fever. And constantly he's thinking about Shastriji Maharaj. When am I going to meet Shastriji Maharaj? Other sadhus and devotees would take care of him. But nevertheless, his health was still very, very ill. And he'd lost all appetite for eating and drinking. Eventually, they gave him a little bit of milk. And he was able to take a little bit of milk with some pepper. 2 or 3 days they spent in Nadiad. And then on the evening of 21st of November, which is Kartak Sud Dasam, Shantilal eventually reached Ahmedabad. Shastriji Maharaj was already there. He had arrived there from Sarangpur. He had got there. And they were... Shastriji Maharaj was resting at a place called Hari Bhakta's house. His Hari Bhakta's name was Babu Bhai. So Babu Bhai, who used to live in Amliwali Port, if you go into Amliwali Port, it's probably the second or the third house on the left. And that's where Shastriji Maharaj was staying at that time. But due to his illness, Shantilal was in no state to talk or walk. So immediately he went upstairs on the second floor and he went there to rest. Meanwhile, Nirgun Swami then sat with Shastriji Maharaj just to update him on the various activities that had taken place over the last few weeks. During that dialogue, Nirgun Swami subtly mentioned that Shantilal is with me. And as soon as Shastriji Maharaj heard that, immediately the conversation changed. And he started asking, oh, when did he come? How is he? Where is he? Immediately, Nirgun Swami realized that Shastriji Maharaj is a little more interested in this. So in these inquiries, Shastriji Maharaj asked more questions. Nirgun Swami explained that Shantilal isn't too well and he's been sleeping. So eventually, Shastriji Maharaj went upstairs because he was very eager and excited to meet Shantilal. So Nirgun Swami then took him upstairs. He explained that he had come to Bochasan. I brought him with me, etc., etc. But now he's got a fever, so he's resting. So hearing this news of Shantilal, Shastriji Maharaj immediately got up. And then he went there where Shantilal was sleeping. As per his usual tendency, just by doing dhun, Shastriji Maharaj met Shantilal. He sat there next to him and he started stroking his head just, gently and blessing him. And he says, well, I can it seems like you have a fever, but don't worry. Everything will slowly subside. Baddu dhime dhime, baddu mati jaise. Just by doing Shastriji Maharaj's darshan, Shantilal already felt at ease. And eventually, he fell asleep. As we move on to page 43 and 44, it talks about Pramukh Swami Maharaj's parshad diksha. Again, in Amliwali Port. Now, there are two houses that are noteworthy in Amliwali Port. The house that we're talking about is Babubhai Kothari's house. This is a different destination or location to where Pramukh Swami Maharaj was eventually given his Pramukh Varni, where the Pramukh Varni took place. Further along the road, when you travel along Amliwali Port, there's another house on the right, on our right. That's where Amliwali Port, where the headquarters or the office was. That's where Shastriji Maharaj eventually made Pramukh Swami Maharaj the Pramukh of the Sanstha. This is where Pramukh Swami Maharaj was taking diksha. So this is Babubhai Kothari's house. So the next day, when Shantilal woke up, the fever had gone. There wasn't any sign of any fever. His headache had gone. He was feeling much, much better. And as soon as he took his bath and he did his puja, he went to meet Shastriji Maharaj. And after doing the darshan of Shastriji Maharaj, he did his danvats to Shastriji Maharaj. And Shastriji Maharaj then asked him and said, Ke tamne diksha apvi che. We want to initiate you into a parshad. And so Shantilal said, when? And Shastriji Maharaj says, right now, atyaraj. And it was such a casual conversation. And Shantilal said, Barabar che Swami, let's do it. When we reflect on this, it's just such a simple dialogue between the three of them and such a big occasion. He's actually now taking diksha, and this is it. But it was just three words, three sentences. Ke diksha apvi che, kyare, atyare, saru. That was it. And Shantilal took diksha. Bhagwan Swaminarayan has mentioned in Gadara section 2, number 61, કે સાચો ભક્ત કેવો કહેવાય કે ભગવાન જો કે તું તત્કાળ પરમહંસ થા અને તત્કાળ પરમહંસ થઈ જાય. In Gadara section 2, number 61, Bhagwan Swaminarayan mentions that a true Hari Bhakt is one who will obey the agna immediately. And when Bhagwan says, I want you to take diksha now, without a fraction of a second of a delay, immediately he would say yes. And we could see this in Shantilal. It must have been around 9 a.m., maybe 10 a.m. that morning. Shastriji Maharaj then placed a white gataryu over Shantilal's body, over his upper body. Shantilal was already wearing a dhoti while he was traveling, but now it was just a question of taking off the upper garment, and he placed a white gataryu over Shantilal. And it was a very simple ceremony. Shastriji Maharaj then transformed Shantilal into a parshad and gave him his new name, Shanti Bhagat. Shastriji Maharaj gave him blessings and guidance, saying કે ખૂબ બળ મળશે, ત્યાગીની જેમ હવે રહેવાનું છે. બ્રહ્મચર્ય પાડી કોઈ ધન નહીં રાખવાનું, રાજીપો તમને થશે. You will gain much strength. You are now to live as a renunciant. You're supposed to follow the vow of celibacy. Don't keep any wealth, any money with you. You will earn the pleasure and the rajipo of Bhagwan. These were the words that Shastriji Maharaj had shared with Shantilal at that time, and Shanti Bhagat at that time. Now, it was just like today's an Ekadashi. It was the day of Ekadashi at that day. It was Prabodhini Ekadashi. Normally, when a sadhu or a parshad gets diksha, they would do mundan. They would shave the hair off. However, as according to the traditions or the customs, Shantila, you don't shave your head on the day of an Ekadashi or the day after. So Shantilal had to have his mundan done 2 days later. So that was on the 2 days later after he got diksha. That's when he did his mundan. Now, something in particular about this day, it's a very historical day for us in the sanstha, in the sampradaya. This Prabodhini Ekadashi marks the same day that Ramanand Swami gave diksha to Nilkant Varni in Piplana at the house of Narsi Mehta in Samvat 1857. And that's when he was named as Sahajanand Swami and Narayan Muni. So you can see the parallels. The same day that Bhagwan Swaminarayan received diksha on Prabodhini Ekadashi was the same day that Shantilal received his Parshadi Diksha and was named Shanti Bhagat. Another interesting fact is that 1 year later, after Bhagwan Swaminarayan received his Diksha, exactly 1 year later, again on the same day, Ramanand Swami ceremoniously initiated Bhagwan Swaminarayan 1 year later. And he gave him the leadership of the Sampradaya at that time. And he appointed him as the head of the Sampradaya. So these are two historical dates, two historical events that took place on the same day as Shanti Bhagat. Shantilal got his Diksha as Shanti Bhagat. As we move on to page 44 and 45, so 3 days after Shanti Bhagat's initiation, Shastriji Maharaj then took him to Bochasan to celebrate the Kartik Punam festival over there. And at that time, they were involved in some seva. There was a lot of work going on in Bochasan at that time as well. So huge, the land had been prepared over there. There was a brick oven that had been prepared, and foundations for the building were going to be dug over there at that time near the Bochasan Mandir. And Shastriji Maharaj had entrusted the seva to some of the Hari Bhaktas to fill in the foundations at that time. They had to dig and fill the foundations at that time. Around 25 Hari Bhaktas were involved in this seva. One of them was Shanti Bhagat. What would happen was that Shantilal would start his katha in the morning. Shastriji Maharaj would do katha in the morning, and as soon as katha was over, everybody would get engaged in this sort of seva at that time. Shastriji Maharaj would actually come there, sit there, and watch all the Hari Bhaktas and inspire them doing the seva at that time. However, it just happened that Shastriji Maharaj had to leave the site to go somewhere else. While everybody was doing seva over here, Shastriji Maharaj had to leave and go somewhere else for another meeting or something. And as soon as Shastriji Maharaj left, because it was getting warmer and hotter at that time, as soon as Shastriji Maharaj left, one by one, people started to drop off. And everybody left. Shantilal was the only one left there doing seva. And Shantilal carried on until eventually Shastriji Maharaj came back and he noticed that everybody had disappeared from this seva. Only Shantilal was still there continuing to do his seva. Again, it was a testimony of Shantilal's his character, that even despite the Guru had left, no one there was there watching. Once he was given an instruction or an agna to carry on doing the seva, he carried on despite nobody being there, despite everybody had left. Shantilal carried on doing his seva. And this was one point where Shastriji Maharaj noticed the integrity in Shanti Bhagat's life. You could see the perseverance that he had in doing his seva. Many, many years later, when Pramukh Swami Maharaj was in Vidyanagar, it was the 18th of July 1982, and all the yuvaks had gathered over there, and they asked Pramukh Swami Maharaj a question, that Swami, would you be able to narrate one incident in which Shastriji Maharaj showed a lot of Rajipo, was very pleased with you? And in response, Pramukh Swami Maharaj narrated this incident, that while he was in Bochasar and he was doing all this seva, and everybody had left, and Shantilal was the only one left there. And eventually when Shastriji Maharaj came, he noticed this. So this was the one prasang that Shantilal recounted as well, recollected in this prasang. As we move on to chapters, to the next page, page 45, it talks about Pramukh Swami Maharaj's education and his studies after taking diksha. So soon after celebrating the festivities of Kartik Purnam in Bochasan, then Shastriji Maharaj instructed Shanti Bhagat to study Sanskrit. Shastriji Maharaj had arranged for Shanti Bhagat to study Sanskrit with Akshar Jivan Swami. We mentioned earlier on the Gordhan Bhai, Akshar Jivan Swami, that was his partner. And Purushothamanand Brahmachari and Hari Swarup Das, all four of them were to go to Bhadran to study. We'll explore more details about the life, their student life as parshads while they were studying in Bhadran in the future lectures. But just for our note over here, that Swami was there in Bhadran, which is very close to Bochasan. But before the group had left for Bhadran, Shastriji Maharaj himself took it upon him to teach the basics of Shabda Rupavali and other aspects of it. So Shanti Bhagat, before he took him to Bochasan, so formally, the first class of Sanskrit that Shanti Bhagat took was given to him by his Guru Shastriji Maharaj. And then on, they went on to Bhadran. While they were in Bhadran, all the santos were staying in the mandir over there. It was a Prasadino mandir. So Shastriji Maharaj and Yogiji Maharaj had often stayed there during their vichran. So they stayed in the mandir over there. There was a Hari Bhakta over there who would look after all the affairs at that time for them as well in the mandir. And in Bhadran, there was a school that was affiliated to the Bhadrakali Mandir. So that's the teacher that they were affiliated with as well. The teacher that was teaching them at that time was Vitthal Ram Shastri, and he used to teach the santos over there as well. We'll read about it more in the next chapters as well. We're coming to the end of this series for today because we've read from pages 1 to 45. But we will explore more details about how Pramukh Swami Maharaj's education was while he was in Bhadran, because they used to have to beg for their food and etc. We will learn that in the next chapters. But for now, we've come to a conclusion for our pages 1 to 45, and we will end the class over here. As we carry on, while we have some time, let us just go through a bit of a summary about what we've actually studied over here. So, looking at the first 50 pages, first 45 pages, where was Shantilal born? He was born in Chansad. Chansad is a village really close to Atladra in Baroda. He was born on a Wednesday on the 7th of December, Magshar Sud Atham. What were his parents' names? His father was Motibhai and his mother was Diwariba. Both of them, both husband and wife, both his parents came from a very strong satsang background. We had heard that Diwali Ba, their family had come into contact with Bhagatji Maharaj. That's since then they have been in satsang. And Moti Bhai, eventually when he came into contact with Shastriji Maharaj, just a few days ago, when Puja Prabodh Muni Swami was reading the report, we heard Pramukh Swami Maharaj also talking about the family background and how strong their satsang background was. They had Pramukh Swami was born into a satsangi family from day one. So the only introduction he had to Akshar was to Akshar Purushottam at that time. As far as their siblings are concerned, Pramukh Swami Maharaj had three brothers, but one of them had passed away in his childhood. So the two brothers that Pramukh Swami Maharaj had known were Daya Bhai and Nandu Bhai. The three brothers were Daya Bhai, Nandu Bhai, and Purushottam Bhai. We had heard previously that Nandu Bhai had taken diksha initially at the hands of Shastriji Maharaj. He was in seva with Yogiji Maharaj, and eventually he decided to come back home and he started looking after the farm. So those were the three brothers, three brothers. In sisters, they had six sisters: Kashi Ben, Kamra Ben, Chanchar Ben, Savita Ben, Ganga Ben, and Dahi Ben. However, three of the sisters had passed away. So four of Pramukh Sai Maharaj's siblings had passed away in their childhood. We learnt about Pramukh Sai Maharaj's nature and his personality as a child, a very, very quiet, very non-complaining, non-confrontive. Also, we learned how he wasn't very fussy, especially when it came to eating food or anything like that. He wasn't fussy about that. In fact, we heard about how his sister Savita Ben would actually keep food specially just for Shantila. It was almost like the favorite sibling, and she would look after him like this. But again, not very fussed about what he would eat. He would eat whatever he was served. In fact, he had to be reminded, "Ke Shanti tare jamano baki che." When he was asked once that did they give you any pocket money, and the answer was yes, he used to get pocket money even while he was in Chansad. And so they asked him, what did you use to buy with your pocket money? Shantilal seldom used his pocket money to buy anything, but when he did, he would buy some jalebi and he would share it with his friends. So we learned about that. These are some little interesting facts. Again, he would show a little bit of interest towards eating puran puri if his mom had made it, but they had two buffaloes at home, and whenever Diwali Baba would offer him milk, he showed reluctance to drinking milk. Dudh na tu pivo emne. And he would often mention that just to keep his mother happy, he would occasionally drink a little bit of milk just to keep her happy. Papachi dudh pachu api deta tha. We had learned that they had moved to a village called Rajnagar, which was nearby, and they spent a few years over there because Moti Bhai was working on a farm over there as well. And there was a very interesting prasang when they were in Rajnagar. There was a Haribhakt Chotu Bhai who used to bring foods for the kids at that time. And it was on an Ekadashi, just like it is again today. On that Ekadashi, when Shantila was very young, he had made some food and prepared some food and was offering it to all the kids. They held a small kids party at that time. Shantilal wouldn't eat, and he was very staunch and held very strong about the fact that he had Ekadashi and he didn't want to eat. To the fact when he got pressured, he started to cry, and obviously, and then everybody caved into to his wishes, and then they gave him some farar. But from his childhood, we could see that he was very, very strong regarding his following his niyams as well. We also learned how particular he was about everything. He would like things very tidy, very neat. He kept his room tidy, he kept his house very tidy. Even in school, Swami said that if the bags were just left around, lying around, he himself would get up and tidy things around. And I think this is something that we had noticed throughout his life, how particular he was. Even when Swami would write his letters, the table next to him, once he had done with his letters, he would make sure he'd switch off the light, put the letters in order, little things like that. The work that we see even today, looking across BAPS, we see all the mandirs and all the work that Swami has done. Very, very organized, very neat, very tidy, very organized, very clean. And these are some things that we had seen throughout his life. Another thing that we learned about his personality and his character was he was very non-confrontational. Would never got into any sorts of arguments, no sorts of conflicts. Swami actually said that when he was a kid, when he was a child, if he saw people fighting, he would cry. He couldn't bear to see conflict. In fact, if we look at it, Adeshivan Sai mentions it, that throughout his life, he spent resolving people's conflicts. And this was one of the things that we noticed about Shantila. We mentioned earlier that they asked Swami that, did you ever go to the farm? And Swami said that we had 2 buffaloes and 2 oxen, and they would take them grazing. So on Sundays or on days of holidays, Pramukh Sai Maharaj would go to the farm with the oxen and the buffaloes so that they would graze. normally around 11 o'clock when they would have lunch. After they've had lunch, then they would go. If we look at Shantilal's life as a child, again, filled with lots of bhakti, we noticed that some traits were very similar to any little child growing up, but there were some things that were very special about him. And I think the fact that he had bhakti in his life was something that stood out a lot. Swami mentioned that while he was in Rajnagar, he didn't have his own personal puja. That he used to sit with his parents and did puja then. But as he grew older and they moved to Chansad, in Chansad, that's when Akshar Swami, Nana Akshar Swami had given him his first puja at that time. And since then, Shantilal had started doing puja. Going to Mandir was like a second home for him. Every day they would go to the Mandir. He would go to the Mandir for the Sandhya Arti. In the evening, they would hang around. All the barracks, they would actually have a competition sometimes to play the nagaras or to play the jhalar. And Swami was very engaged in going to the Mandir regularly over there for darshan. There was a niyam in the family that if you don't go to Mandir for darshan, then you don't get any meals to eat at night. And so that was the deal. And Shantilal's mother, Diwali, would often check up at the Mandir with the pujari. Ke Shanti ghare Mandir avyo che ke nahi? Shantilal had a 100% score. He had always visited the Mandir. And so these are some things that we learnt about him. Again, his first meeting with Shastriji Maharaj was in the Mandir in Chansad as well. He would also visit other Mandirs as well. And we learnt that he had a friend called Shanti, with whom he would regularly go to the Mandir to spend some time and listen to Kathavarta, where him and Shanti had one point listened to the Ramayana, and they'd heard about Rishikesh and Haridwar, and the two of them had decided that in the future we both want to leave home and we want to spend our time in Rishikesh and Haridwar. We mentioned that the Sant Samagam that they would do a lot, Bal Mukund Swami, Ghanshyam Swami, and Akshar Swami, these are the three santos that would come regularly to the Mandir. And Shantilal would spend his time there in seva. He also mentioned that the santos had taught him how to sing bhajans. Joy Murti Manohar, Akshar Purushottam Dayadu Prabhu. These are the bhajans that they had learned in the Mandir as well. Another aspect was how the village had a bhajan mandadi, where they would go from one mandir to another mandir and they would do bhajans. And Shantilal was always engaged and enjoyed doing bhajan. So many a time we've seen, I remember in 1988 when Pramukh Swami Maharaj was here, they had given Pramukh Swami Maharaj kartals. And this was one thing that we had seen many a time where Pramukh Swami Maharaj would play kartals while he was singing bhajans or while other people were singing bhajans, and he enjoyed doing that. And this is something that he had carried on with him through his childhood as well. As far as his education was concerned, Swami studied in Chansad until his standard 5, until his 5th year. There weren't enough students to carry on, and they didn't have a 6th year, so he had to take a drop at that time. Despite that, Shantilal was still so focused in looking for an education, so he went from one village to another village looking for a teacher. And they found a teacher in the village called Dharapara. The man was ready to teach all the students. He said, "You gather the students and I will take your 6th year." Shantilal got together about 10 to 12 students, about 10 students they needed at that time. Unfortunately, the teacher said that only if you have a student from my village will I carry on studying. And they couldn't find another student from that village. So those plans also got dropped. So Shantilal had to take a drop for a year at that time. During that year, he traveled with the Santos. And as we heard in the last lecture, Swami would go to Anand. He would wash the utensils. We heard his experiences with Ghanshyam Swami, how Ghanshyam Swami told him once to go and collect some draksh layauje, go get some grapes. And Shantilal, for him, it was a new experience to go to Vadodara to go and buy some grapes. And eventually he went there and he went and got him some green grapes. And Ghanshyam Swami got upset. He said, "Main tane aa draksh lawani kidi che? Tane khabar nathi padti?" And Shantilal wasn't aware of it. He was supposed to get some raisins. Instead of raisins, he went and got him some grapes. But Ghanshyam Swami wasn't particular about that. So we heard that prasang as well. Eventually, while they were traveling, when they came to Bochasan, then Shastriji Maharaj taught him his first Shabda Rupavali while he was in Bochasan. So we learnt about that. Moti Bhai then came and took Shantilal back home, and he ended up studying in Padra. We learnt that Padra was not too far, was about 10 to 12 kilometers, 6 kilometers away. So his total journey would be about 10 to 12 kilometers. Shantilal would travel. Sometimes he would walk to Padra, to his school. Sometimes he would get a ride on his friend's bicycle. He would take a friend's bike and they would ride together. Eventually, we heard that his parents bought him a bicycle, a second-hand bicycle, a Hercules bicycle, which cost about 15 to 17 rupees at that time. And we also learned how he learned how to ride. We heard that Swami said that he He had also fallen once or twice. He said, I never injured myself severely, but I did fall once or twice. We learned about his sporting skills. He was a very good swimmer. They used to play football. They used to play cricket. They used to play Kho, Amli Pipri, Hutu Tutu, all these kind of games they played. We learned about those things as well. He was an expert at all these things. So these are some of the things that we recounted. This was just a brief summary. Now we will end today's lecture. Sri Swaminarayan Bhagwanani Jai.